What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the first two episodes of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and I'll start with some general kind of broad strokes and spoiler-free comments for anybody out there who is on the fence, and then as the review goes, and I'll give you a fair warning, I'll dive into specifics, but as you can tell from the bookshelf behind me, I like fantasy, and when it comes to fantasy movies, shows, books, etc., the devil is always in the details. But in that this is the most expensive TV show ever made and is based on a beloved franchise, it has been under intense scrutiny ever since it was announced, and there have been a lot of people who every step of the way have been determined either to say it can do no wrong or it can do no right. And this video is not going to be either one of those, so if you only want love or hate, sorry, this is not going to be the video that will please you, although I should admit in advance, I didn't like the show, but I'm not gonna go crazy and rip my hair out. I don't have any hair, but I'm gonna try and just be calm and objective, and it's not a total loss. I'm gonna keep watching it, but I've got a lot of reservations about it and a lot of critiques and a few things that I kind of enjoyed. But let's start with the basics. It was developed by showrunners J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, who wrote the first episode. Second episode was written by Jennifer Hutchison, and both episodes were directed by J.A. Bayona. There are 6 more episodes in this season, and apparently Amazon's planning on doing 50 episodes total, with a season 2 expected to be filmed in October. And if I were to try to put my finger on my one main source of frustration with what I've seen so far, it's with the writing. And I think there are going to be a lot of people out there who don't give a damn about the books or the appendices or the Silmarillion or any of Tolkien's texts. All they care about is it a fun show to watch? I feel like no matter what the nerds like myself might say about the lore, whatever the case might be, in the end, a show will survive or thrive or fail based on whether or not it's entertaining, if people are enjoying the ride. And the first episode of this show was so endless and so aimless and so utterly devoid of any dramatic tension, I think a lot of people were just going to bail entirely and never come back around. And maybe episode 2 is a teeny bit stronger, but it blows my mind that we're now 2 hours into this story, a little like 2 hours and 20 minutes because they're long episodes, and no real overall story has emerged. But all the Tolkien fans know, in theory, what the overall story is going to be, because Tolkien wrote about the Second Age, both in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. You can see my bookmarks here. Basically, this section to this section is all the material that is written at the back of The Return of the King about the Númenóreans and the forging of the Rings of Power, and eventually the last alliance of elves and men. Those are like the 3 major events of the Second Age. But sadly, the Silmarillion, which has a little bit more text, and you'll see this is my bruised and battered copy that I've read 3-4 times. Anyway, the pages are turning brown. I've read it so much. The Silmarillion has more material in the Second Age, but not a ton more. But sadly, the show does not have the rights to the Silmarillion, so they're in a weird position where they can adapt stuff written by Tolkien about the Second Age in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, but they're unable to mention anything from the Silmarillion unless it's also mentioned in the appendices of The Return of the King. It's a very strange, legal, creative limbo that they find themselves in. And because they're spending $1 billion on this show, it's surprising to me that somebody didn't raise their hand at one point and be like, this is a strange place to start this giant show. It's kind of like building a giant skyscraper when you know you've got a flawed foundation and you just pretend like the flawed foundation is not going to be a problem. Not having access to the Silmarillion, which is a brilliant read. If you like great mythic epic fantasy written like a history book, the Silmarillion is really tough to beat. But the fact that they don't have the rights to it, I was worried in advance, but then my fears were immediately confirmed by like the first 5 or 10 minutes of the show, where they do a very loose approximation of the First Age, which leads up to the events in this show. And it bears no resemblance to the First Age in the Silmarillion because, once again, they don't have the rights. But one of these days, somebody will swoop in and maybe do like an animated history of the First Age, and it'll be the coolest, most epic, grand, phenomenal thing that human beings have ever laid eyes on, if they can even capture 10% of the greatness of the Silmarillion. But I don't want to get sidetracked. But the very loose premise of this show is that after a very long and costly war with Morgoth, where the elves had to sacrifice a great deal, We've now seen several centuries of peace, and some elves like Galadriel are convinced that Sauron is still out there, that there's a threat that is not even sleeping, it's just lying in wait, waiting for an opportunity to reemerge. And you've got various humans and dwarves and elves and Harfoots. They're not hobbits, they're like an ancestral version of hobbits, but all the other creatures of Middle-earth are kind of living in blissful ignorance of the looming threat on the horizon. But if you're just a casual viewer or just curious about this show, nowhere in these first 2 hours would there be any indication about where the story's going or what to expect. And I think that's going to be incredibly frustrating for a lot of people. Like, wind the clock back to 2001 when Fellowship of the Ring came out. You had this astonishing intro which showed the last alliance of elves and men. That showed the downfall of Sauron. You had this incredible voiceover narration by Cate Blanchett, who plays Galadriel in a superior fashion. But it completely, totally set the stage. And I can remember just like drooling and salivating while watching that sequence. And I'd gone to a midnight screening on the opening night. Back then, they didn't have earlier screenings. And I basically was going to have to pull an all-nighter and be at work like at 6 or 7 the next morning. But I was like, I don't fucking care. I'm seeing this movie. And it was just an awe-inspiring experience. And every diehard Tolkien fan is going to have their quibbles about where those movies zigged and zagged. But for the most part, The Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King were incredibly satisfying movies. I mean, I saw Return of the King 6 fucking times in the theater and cried like a baby several times during the Riders of Rohan sequence when they ride in to save everyone at Minas Tirith. But I don't want to get sidetracked talking about something cooler like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. So in short, the problems that are plaguing this show so far, it moves at a glacial pace. It just feels endless. It feels slow. And the dialogue is just pitiful. I mean, the dialogue so often, it sounds like really kind of bland, optimistic, like self-help books you see like in a grocery store or like greeting cards. The dialogue, people are going to people are going to generate a lot of clicks online assembling highlight reels of all the cheesy, ridiculous lines that are just sprinkled throughout all this show. And they're trying to be aspirational and hopeful and wise and insightful. But the dialogue was just making me scream in horror because I think too often they're trying to make the characters seem cute, especially out of the Harfoots and the dwarves. I was like, oh my God, please kill me. Like, the more you reach for cuteness, the more I just want to cut my own throat. And another big problem is that there's a huge, giant cast of characters, most of whom never say or do anything interesting at all. And some are more interesting than others. But two of the coolest characters in all of fantasy literature are Elrond and Galadriel. And the way they're written by Tolkien, I mean, people devote their entire lives to becoming Tolkien scholars, just obsessing over every little line because Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon and a professor of English literature at Oxford. He knew what he was doing when it came to the written word, and he wrote like a poet. But he'd also seen combat in the trenches in World War I, and he had this real lust for myth and legend and fantasy. And all those ingredients came together to form this unique writer who has been delighting people with his words for many, many decades. I've read Lord of the Rings many times. I've read The Hobbit many times. I've read The Silmarillion many times. He just casts a spell on the reader, and there's a richness to his history and his languages and the complexity of the culture. But writers like Tolkien don't grow on trees, and it's a really tough ask to get a group of writers together on a TV show to try to replicate that spell that Tolkien was able to cast. But in spite of all the horrible things that I'm saying about this show, at a minimum, it looks fantastic. There are no stars in this show, so every single dollar of this giant, colossal budget is up on the screen. And I've seen some people saying that they're spending roughly $60 million per episode. I mean, that's disgraceful. I mean, I think House of the Dragon spends about $20 million an episode, and House of the Dragon is, well, 1/3 as expensive, but more than 3 times as entertaining. But I'll be very curious to see how Amazon judges whether or not this show is a success or not, because to be a success, it has to appeal to more than just the diehard fantasy nerds out there. I mean, look at a show like The Boys. The show for the audience for The Boys is enormous, far bigger than the audience ever was for the comic. But Amazon has a kind of a troubled track record. For every cool show like The Boys or Invincible, they'll have a complete turd blossom like The Wheel of Time. And The Wheel of Time, you see the fantasy books over my shoulder, is much worse than The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. I can at least watch The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and I'll continue to watch it. I at least want to have an informed opinion about the show moving forward because Tolkien is very important to me. And who knows, it might get better. It could get a lot better. I mean, we haven't seen really anything yet. So hopefully the best is yet to come. So like with any show that's at the center of a giant culture war, I think this show is going to land somewhere where it's not quite as horrible as its detractors would have you believe, but it's nowhere near as good as its defenders would have you believe either. And I guess in this era of tribalism, an era where I never have been able to successfully find a tribe that I want to call my own, I guess I'm just going to announce a brand new tribe, and everybody's invited. And the only requirement for membership is that you have to enjoy reading fantasy, and that's a wide net that has captured many people all around the world, especially those people out there who were reading all these great fantasy books before they were ever big budget shows and movies. And I feel like in a lot of ways, we're living in a weird time for fantasy because we've got more amazing options than ever before, where you've got shows like House of the Dragon or movies like The Spine of Night, or video games like Elden Ring, or books by authors like Joe Abercrombie. It's an incredibly good time to be a fantasy fan, which makes fantasy fans much more rigorous in their criticisms when something like The Wheel of Time doesn't work and lets people down. Or a show like The Witcher should be the gold standard of fantasy, and I've thrown up my hands in despair and given up on The Witcher entirely. But here's the sad reality about the fantasy genre. Most fantasy movies, shows, games, and books are not so good. I grew up in the 80s where we had a lot of fantasy movies, and only a handful of them were worth remembering. I mean, Conan the Barbarian is kind of the gold standard. And if you went into any local bookstore, the shelves were breaking under the weight of all the fantasy novels, and a lot of them were just kind of thinly veiled ripoffs of their favorite authors. So the fantasy genre has a lot of dead weight out there, and so far it appears as if The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power might just be some dead weight, but here's the silver lining. If 1% of the people who check out this show decide to pick up The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion and fall into it and become lifelong fans of Tolkien's work, I'll chalk that up as a positive. So let's get into some of the nuts and bolts as to why this show is struggling to get out of the starting gate. I think it's because J.R.R. Tolkien's world is one that doesn't readily lend itself to other writers playing in that sandbox. We saw this with Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies, where they took a book that's pretty short, broke it up into 3 epic movies, and they had to invent a lot of material, and it was just a train wreck. I mean, I hated the Hobbit movies, the second and third one in particular. First one, I was like, hey, maybe it'll still be good. But the second and third were just god-awful because they were just inventing all this stupid nonsense. It's hard to write like Tolkien. It's hard to write scenes that match Tolkien. And even the films that I love, like Fellowship of the Ring, even those don't always get everything right. I mean, the scenes where the Fellowship are debating whether or not to go over the mountains or into Moria, and then the dialogue leading up to when the doors finally open, they completely rip those scenes to pieces. And I remember at the time being incredibly frustrated. But sometimes people pull it off. Like Rankin and Bass pulled it off with the 1977 animated The Hobbit. And Ralph Bakshi had some incredible scenes in his Lord of the Rings animated adaptation, which was basically just a book and a half because he never got a chance to do the second movie. But there are writers out there who have created worlds that are like a big giant sandbox that invite the participation of other writers. Like I'm wearing a Miskatonic University shirt. And for people out there who know who H.P. Lovecraft is, he would actively solicit input and stories from other writers to flesh out his grand mythos, and slowly but surely, a lot of those writers would go on to have their own careers. Or take it something like Marvel Comics in the 60s. Stan Lee was kind of the architect, but he had a lot of great writers and artists fleshing it out, and so it was an environment, like a shared universe or a shared continuity or connectivity, where it was very easy for a lot of writers to make contributions and play. And I feel like with Tolkien, it's one voice, it's one man, and I feel like the shows and movies and cartoons and games that are successful on this front are those where the storytellers place their vision and their talents in service of Tolkien as opposed to trying to replace or add to Tolkien. And what this show is lacking so far, I think it's that magical quality which will make it appeal to people who don't give a damn about Tolkien. Like one of the biggest lovable dumbasses that I've ever known was obsessed with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he would be the first to admit that he had no idea what was happening. He had no idea where anything was like on the map. He was clueless, but he loved every second. He just wanted to live in that world. He wanted to be a soldier fighting for Aragorn, marching on Mordor, and he just loved it. And so that world the way Peter Jackson tackled it, he invited everybody in and created a whole new generation of fans. And I don't think this show is going to pull that off at all, because you got to love the characters. And people loved Legolas, and they loved Gimli, and they loved Gandalf, and they loved Aragorn, and they loved the hobbits. People loved all those characters. They particularly liked Galadriel and Elrond. And I think one of the biggest achievements of this show is somehow managing to make me not like those characters, or even not like characters like Gil-galad or characters like Celebrimbor. I mean, these are some of the most major elven characters that Tolkien ever came up with. And the elves are just... Actually, I shouldn't say the elves are awful in the show. There is one exception. He got a ton of pushback prior to the arrival of the show. However, Ismael Cruz Cordova as Arondir, so far, he might be my favorite character in the show. Probably because he's a very humble, quiet guy who just goes out and gets things done. And he's in love with the humans. So he's got this pressure on him because all the elves will be leaving Middle-earth soon. And obviously he's in love with a human woman. But also he's one of the few that seems to be aware of the fact that there is this growing threat. So he starts investigating. But I have to say, he's pretty cool. And he seems to be pretty cool in combat and that sort of thing. Most of the action in this show so far is pretty weak. I mean, there's a big giant scene in the first episode where Galadriel fights a snow troll. And it was like watching a Power Ranger show. And the reason I know about Power Rangers is because I have a lot of nieces and nephews between ages 3 and 9. And some of them fucking love Power Rangers. But that scene was just brutal. And what's missing from this interpretation of Galadriel is how in just a few short sentences and a few short scenes in the novel The Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien was able to convey just how powerful she truly was. When she faces her test of whether or not to take the ring from Frodo when he offers it to her, she immediately recognizes that instead of having a Dark Lord Sauron ruling over all of them, that instead he would replace them with a Dark Queen, and that everybody would look upon her in despair. And you're just like, whoa, that's when you suddenly realize that she's as powerful as Saruman or Gandalf or Elrond or any of them, or perhaps more so. I mean, she might be, in that entire Middle-earth continuity, the most powerful force out there apart from Sauron. And she never has to pick up a sword. She never has to put on armor. The way she expresses herself communicates volumes. Same with Elrond. In the novel, all he does is talk. He has the Council of Elrond. He offers advice, but you're just like, whoa, Elrond. He is a total fucking badass. But there's no getting around the fact that I just really intensely dislike the way those two characters have been portrayed so far. And not to be a giant lore nerd, but there's this stupid throwaway line at one point where somebody shows up and says, Elrond, you're not allowed to go to this meeting because only elven lords are. For anybody who knows Elrond's parentage and any of the stories of Arendelle, Elrond comes from the most storied and respected and awe-inspiring family tree in all of Tolkien. And in the First Age, Arendelle quite literally saved the planet when he sailed to Valinor and managed to rally all the forces that came over to Middle-earth and ultimately dethroned and destroyed Morgoth and locked him away. Elrond is that guy's son. So the fact that people would kind of shit on Elrond in this show is absurd. So of all the Elronds that we've seen on the screen so far, whether you're talking the two cartoons from the 70s or Peter Jackson's live-action films, this is by far the weakest Elrond of all the Elronds. But he's not nearly as lame as these Harfoots, and I knew bringing in the Harfoots was a bad idea. For people who don't know what a Harfoot is, in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, there's a little section called Concerning Hobbits, and when they're talking about the ancestry of hobbits, Harfoots are an earlier version of hobbits. And they're unendurable because every single line is about, I want to go out and see the world, and they're basically trying to make them these cute little wide-eyed little creatures. And I think Tolkien might be the only person in history who's managed to make little small creatures seem noble and heroic. Like Samwise Gamgee is one of the most heroic characters in all of English literature. And he's so incredible and so humble and such a badass. But it takes a writer like Tolkien to make them interesting. If you play games like Dungeons and Dragons, when people choose to be like gnomes or halflings or whatever, most people have an attitude of just killing them all on sight. But we have this character, Nori Brandyfoot, who wants to see the world. She comes from an environment where, everybody just kind of sticks with their little wandering tribe. And, these scenes make it feel like a show for, little tiny kids. And I guess the only part of her story that's vaguely interesting is that this mysterious stranger has fallen out of the sky, crashed into the planet, and no one really knows who he is yet. And who knows, maybe he'll end up being one of Sauron's servants. Maybe he'll end up being like a younger iteration of one of the wizards that comes to Middle-earth in the Third Age. Who can say? So I'm very curious about what the identity of the stranger might be, but I'm sure whatever the answer is, it's going to drive me fucking crazy because it's probably going to vomit all over the lore, and I hate to be a lore whore, but I like these books. So once you fall in love with this stuff, it's hard to let this stuff go. And along those lines, and this is going to make me sound like the world's biggest dork, but the way this show depicts when elves are allowed to return to the Undying Lands, as if it's up to Gil-galad to kind of pick and choose who gets that honor. Once again, I was puking in my mouth. It almost is like you can't even discuss something without wanting to go off on some like giant tangent or temper tantrum. Let's just say I didn't like those scenes with Gil-galad. Gil-galad should be the baddest motherfucker in history, and he just sucks balls. And so far it appears as if Celebrimbor is going to suck as well, and he should be. I mean, he's one of the greatest smiths out of all the elves, apart from Feanor, who created the Silmarils, which were stolen by Morgoth, which ignited all these wars in the First Age. But apart from him, Celebrimbor is the greatest smith that the elves have ever seen, and he just seems like a big middle-aged goober in this, but who knows? Maybe he'll get cool as he starts working with Sauron and working on the Rings of Power. So moving on to episode 2, we get a lot more of the stranger. Once again, I'm praying he won't turn out to be a younger version of Gandalf, because Gandalf came to Middle-earth in the Third Age, but I wouldn't put it past this show at all to be like, it's a Lord of the Rings show, we need Gandalf, but that would drive me fucking crazy. We get a lot of material in episode 2 with Prince Durin IV, who's one of the major dwarves that Elrond and Celebrimbor want to work with on this upcoming giant project. Basically, they want to build like the greatest forge imaginable, and they're going to need the help of the dwarves. And Durin's feelings have been hurt because Elrond hasn't come around a while, and he's married and had kids and that sort of thing. But all the scenes with the dwarves and all their various rituals, and once again, this show's trying to make them too cute, and those drive me fucking crazy. I love the dwarves of Middle-earth, and I love Thorin, and I love Gimli, and I love all those characters. So far, I'm just not buying it when it comes to the dwarves, especially when you have these really cheesy lines, like when Elrond says to Durin's wife, "Where there is love, it is never truly dark." I mean, once again, somebody needs to put together a highlight reel of all the cheesy lines from just the first 2 episodes, and it'll get 10 million clicks. And speaking of stupid lines, there's a scene where the Harfoots are interacting with the stranger, and he's interacting with the lanterns, which have little fireflies inside to give them light. And he seems to be speaking with them, and somebody's like, "Oh, what's he saying?" And someone says, "I don't speak firefly." Anyway, the dialogue is just awful. The dialogue is the Achilles heel of this show, and also the lack of structure. There's just no sense of urgency to the plot whatsoever. But apparently the stranger wants some help finding some stars. I don't know if I even care. And another source of drama in this episode is Bronwyn and her son get attacked by an orc. And we see that her son's got this like piece of a blade that seems to be gaining shape as it feeds on blood. And obviously it's going to be like a blade of Mordor or a blade of one of the servants of Sauron or whatever the case might be. But I imagine he'll be one of many humans that goes over to the dark side and works for Sauron. But the last big source of drama is everything that happens to Galadriel at sea after jumping overboard and refusing to return to the Undying Lands. She's basically swimming hundreds of miles home when she bumps into these humans that are stranded on a raft, and they're being attacked by this giant worm, as they describe. It's basically a big giant sea monster, and it's slowly but surely picking them off and breaking their ship apart. And in the end, Halbrand and Galadriel have to do a little bonding, and have to rely upon one another to survive. And at the very end, we see a big giant ship pulling up that's going to save them. And for anybody who knows anything about the Lord of the Rings, it's one of those Numenorian ships that's going to take them to the Isle of Numenor. And anyway, the Second Age, all the great scenes and all the great characters and all the great drama of the Second Age written by Tolkien, it's all about the rise and the thriving and the inevitable downfall of the Numenorians, and then eventually the survivors that we see in the last alliance of elves and men, with Elendil and his 2 sons, when obviously they go up against Sauron, etc. and so forth. But next episode, I'm assuming we'll get a big deep dive into Numenor, so hopefully it'll be cool. I will be watching episode 3. And I genuinely, sincerely hope that the show will pick up its pace. I genuinely, sincerely hope that it will introduce some stakes. It really needs some villains. I mean, think back to Fellowship of the Ring. Between Sauron and Saruman and the Uruk-hai, I mean, we had so many killer villains that were legitimate threats. Or the friggin' Balrog down in Mines of Moria. This show is, 2 hours deep with no tension whatsoever. And I'm sure there are going to be some people in the days and weeks to come. We get mad at the readers for criticizing this show and saying that they're gatekeepers or purists or whatever. But the only thing I'll say on that front is, obviously, Tolkien deserves all the credit in the world for creating this world. But if not for the readers who for many decades kept this world alive, or the many artists like Alan Lee and John Howe who helped bring it to life, none of these shows or movies would even happen. And so maybe all the people out there, instead of calling the readers purists and gatekeepers, they should be thanking them, saying, hey, thank you for buying all these books, like in multiple editions. I mean, I've got Lord of the Rings here, but I've also got the Lord of the Rings here, and Silmarillion's right here, and the Silmarillion's also right here. Like, that's why people find these properties to be bankables, because nerds like myself will buy multiple copies, and one for reading to death in the bathtub and one for display, etc. and so forth. At any rate, I was reading this stuff long before it was considered mainstream entertainment. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, being a fan of fantasy definitely gave you giant nerd status. But what's funny is when you compare this to House of the Dragon, both shows have about the same amount of material to work with, and it's just going to be fascinating for the next 5, 6, 7 weeks, comparing and contrasting what each show does differently from the other. Because in the case of both shows, they're creating shows that are adapted from stories that are written like history books, and so far I think House of the Dragon has been a very fun ride. I'm really enjoying it, and it might be the show that I'm most excited about for the rest of the year. But with all the benefit of hindsight, with Amazon spending the amount of money that they're spending, my advice would have been get the rights to the Silmarillion and adapt the First Age in its entirety. There's so many giant story arcs in the First Age with so many astonishing characters where they wouldn't have had to make up a goddamn thing. They could just adapt those stories and it would have blown people's minds. But I think I've said enough for now. Maybe I'll be back to say more next week. Maybe I won't, depending upon how much I enjoy episode 3. But if you haven't heard already, it's smooth sack summer. When you're playing in the summer sun, make sure you're escaped from pubes to bum. That's right, this is the summer to keep your balls cool while still looking hot with Manscaped. The leader in below the belt grooming is making sure we have a ball this summer by giving our pants partners everything they need to stay fresh. Dive headfirst into smooth sack summer by going to manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping with our code WRONGREEL. That's WRONGREEL in all caps. There'll be a link in the description below. But just in case you remain unconvinced, the Manscaped Performance Package 4.0 has everything you need to prepare that summer bod. Inside this package, you'll find their Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker ears and nose hair trimmer, Crop Preserver ball deodorant, Crop Reviver toner, Performance Boxer briefs, and a travel bag to hold all your goodies. So I look forward to hearing what everybody's thoughts are in the comments below. I'm expecting a wide range of reactions from both readers as well as non-readers, as well as just people who are kind of casually curious. It's the most expensive show ever made. It's got a lot of eyeballs on it, and there'll be a lot of opinions. And yeah, everybody's opinion is valid. I'd just be curious to see if Amazon declares this, home run or a victory, or tries to spike the football, or if they acknowledge that they have some work to do in the episodes and seasons to come. But that's all I've got to say for now. So please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and hunt me down on Twitter at Geeking Out if you want to tell me how wrong I was about any of my assertions in this review. But I can't thank you for watching and listening, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.